An old man is walking out of the Stoa in Athens, and as he steps down from the colonnade, his foot catches on the stone, and he falls, and in falling, he breaks a toe. He strikes the ground with his hand, and quoting a line from a lost tragedy, he says to the earth, I come, why dost thou call for me? Then he rises, walks home, and refuses to eat. He is 98 years old, or perhaps 72. The sources disagree, and he has taught in that painted porch for more than half a century. His name is Zeno, son of Menasseus, a Phoenician from the town of Citium on the island of Cyprus, and the school he founded takes its name from the colonnade where he lectured. Diogenes Laertius, writing 4 or 5 centuries after the event, records this as the manner of his death: a stumble, a quoted line, a voluntary silence at the table until the breath ceased. We are told this is how the first Stoic ended, not by illness that overtook him, not by violence, not by the slow indignity of a body forgetting itself, but by a decision made in the space between a fall and the walk home. And it is with this decision that we must sit, if we are to understand what Zeno believed a human life was for, and what he believed a human death could be. Let us reflect then on what is called in Greek the kathekon, and in the older Latin the officium, and in English, imperfectly, the fitting act. This is the principle by which Zeno's school measured a life, and by which, if Diogenes Laertius tells us truly, Zeno measured his own leaving of it. The kathekon is not the same as what later moralists would call duty, though duty is one of its provinces. Zeno used the word to name any action that, when performed, admits of a reasonable defense. A plant draws water toward its roots. This is fitting for a plant. An animal seeks its food, protects its young, flees from what would harm it. These acts are fitting for animals, and a human being rational, has fitting acts proper to a rational creature: to honor one's parents, to keep faith with one's friends, to serve one's country, to preserve one's body when preservation accords with reason, and, when the circumstances so incline, to leave the body behind. The last of these is the hard saying, and we must approach it slowly, because it is easy to misread. Zeno did not teach, and no orthodox Stoic after him taught, that a man is free to end his life whenever life becomes displeasing. On the contrary, the whole apparatus of Stoic ethics is built to make the wise man indifferent to what most people find displeasing: pain, poverty, exile, the loss of reputation, the loss of those we love. These are the very conditions in which the philosopher demonstrates that virtue is sufficient and that nothing external can harm him. To flee such conditions by opening a vein would be a confession that virtue was not, after all, sufficient. And yet the Stoics did teach, and Zeno was the first to teach it clearly, that there is a door, and that the door is not locked. The image is Epictetus's from a later century, but the thought is Zeno's. If the room fills with smoke, one goes out. The smoke here is not discomfort. The smoke is a condition in which the fitting acts of a rational life become impossible to perform: extreme and irremediable illness, mutilation that prevents virtue's exercise, a tyrant's command that would compel one to act unjustly. Under such conditions, and only under such conditions, the departure itself becomes the fitting act. Diogenes Laertius, in his Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, preserves for us the language of the school on this point. He tells us that the Stoics held it reasonable for the wise man to make his exit from life on behalf of his country, on behalf of his friends, or if he should suffer intolerable pain, mutilation, or incurable disease. The list is deliberately narrow. It is not a permission slip. It is a description of the edge of the map, past which the ordinary obligations of continued life no longer bind. And this is where Zeno's own death, as Diogenes reports it, becomes philosophically interesting. He did not die of intolerable pain. He did not die under a tyrant's compulsion. He broke a toe. By any modern accounting, and by most ancient ones, this is not a reason to stop eating. What did he see in that moment on the stones of Athens that made him quote a tragedian and walk home to fast? To answer that, we must know something of the man and of the world in which he had made his life. Zeno was not born an Athenian. He was born, we are told, around the year 334 before the Common Era, in the port city of Citium on the southern coast of Cyprus. Citium was a Phoenician settlement, and Zeno's family were merchants, dealing, according to some accounts, in the dye called Tyrian purple, that expensive pigment drawn from the murex shell which colored the robes of kings. His father, Menasseus, traveled often to Athens on business and brought back books, among them, we are told, the Socratic dialogues, which the young Zeno read. He came to Athens himself, the story goes, by accident. He was 30 years old, or perhaps 22, and he was shipwrecked. His cargo, purple dye of great value, was lost in the sea near Piraeus. He walked up from the port into the city, dispossessed, a foreigner, without his goods, and he wandered into a bookseller's shop. The bookseller was reading aloud from Xenophon's Memorabilia an account of Socrates. Zeno asked where such men as this Socrates could be found. At that moment, we are told, the cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes was passing in the street, and the bookseller pointed and said, "Follow that man." Whether this happened as described, or whether Diogenes Laertius has arranged the accident too neatly, one cannot say. But it is what the tradition preserved, and the tradition preserved it because it captures something true about how Zeno understood his own life. He would later say, so Diogenes reports, that he had made a prosperous voyage when he suffered shipwreck. The loss of the purple was the beginning of the philosophy. He studied first with Crates the cynic, who taught him to be indifferent to shame and to social station. He studied then with Stilpo of Megara, a logician, and with Xenocrates and Polemo, who taught in the academy that Plato had founded. He read widely, he lived plainly. He was, by every description, thin, dark-skinned, with a slight limp or twist to his neck, and a face that people described as sour or crabbed. He drank little. He ate mostly bread and figs and honey. He avoided crowds. When invited to dinners, he sat at the end of the couch, which pleased him because it kept him at some remove from the conversation. Around the year 301 before the Common Era, he began to teach in his own right. He chose for his school not a building, but a covered walkway on the north side of the Athenian agora, the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, so called because its walls bore frescoes of the Battle of Marathon and of the sack of Troy. He taught there because it was public, and because it was free, and because a man who taught in a colonnade rather than in an enclosed garden made a statement about what philosophy was. Philosophy was for the street, for anyone who would stop and listen. His students called themselves at first Zenonians, but the name did not hold. They came to be called the men of the Stoa, Stoics. Athens in this period was no longer the Athens of Pericles. It was a city under the shadow of the Macedonian successors of Alexander. its independence intermittent, its power a memory. Zeno lived through the reigns of several kings and the sieges of several generals. Antigonus II, Gonatas, king of Macedon, was said to have attended his lectures when he visited the city and to have called him friend. When the Athenians honored Zeno with a golden crown and a public tomb, the decree they passed made mention of the fact that he had lived in their city for more than 50 years, that he had made the young men who followed him better, and that he had, throughout, conducted himself in accordance with his own teaching. That last clause is the one that matters, in accordance with his own teaching. The Athenians, who were not sentimental about their philosophers and who had killed one of them within living memory, noticed that this one had not contradicted himself. He wrote a book called The Republic, of which we possess only fragments and rumors, in which he sketched a city of the wise, a city without temples, without law courts, without money, without marriage as an institution, and, some sources say, without clothing. The book scandalized later generations of Stoics who tried to explain it away as the work of Zeno's early Cynic period. Perhaps it was, perhaps it was not. What we can say is that the man who wrote it did not think philosophy was a matter of adjusting oneself to existing arrangements. He thought it was a matter of asking what a rational being would build if a rational being were building. He lived then a long life in one city, teaching in one colonnade, refusing most honors, accepting a few, walking each morning from his lodgings to the porch, and each evening back. He never married. He had no children we know of. His property at his death was modest. And when, one afternoon in his old age, he stumbled on the step of the Stoa and broke a toe, he understood something that we, at this distance, must try to understand with him. What did he understand? To answer, we must return to the doctrine of the fitting act and press it harder. Zeno held, and his school after him held, that a human life is a performance of a role assigned by nature. The playwright is not us. The playwright is the logos, the rational order of the cosmos, which is also, in Zeno's theology, identical with God. Our task is to play the role well. A short role played well is better than a long role played badly. And there comes a point, in some lives, when the role is complete. The Stoics use the metaphor of the banquet. One is invited to the feast. One eats what is passed. When the dish comes near, one takes a portion, decently, without grabbing. When the dish passes on, one does not reach after it. And when one has eaten enough, one rises and leaves, thanking the host. To linger at the table after one is full is not a sign of gratitude. It is a sign of gluttony. Zeno, at 98, or at whatever age he was, had eaten. He had founded a school. He had written his books. He had trained his successor, Cleanthes, who would carry the doctrine forward. He had received the honors he was willing to receive. He had lived, in the Athenians' own words, in accordance with his teaching. And now, on the stones outside the porch, where he had taught for half a century, his body had, for the first time, failed him in a way it had not failed him before. A broken toe is a small thing, but to a man who walks each day to his work, a broken toe is a signal. The body is beginning to refuse the role. He quoted, "We are told, a line from a tragedy. I come, why dost thou call for me?" The line is thought to be from a play of Timotheus or of some other tragedian whose work is lost. What matters is not the source, but the address. The earth is calling. He answers. He does not resist. He does not bargain. He does not consult a physician about whether the toe might heal. He treats the fall as the summons it may be, and he goes home to consider whether the summons is real. He then, according to Diogenes, held his breath until he died. Other sources say he starved himself. Others still say he strangled himself. The variation among the reports tells us that later Stoics found the death both important and difficult and rehearsed different versions of it for different audiences. What all versions preserve is the essential fact. He chose the moment, and the moment was tied to a stumble. Was this rational? Was this the fitting act? Or was it a philosopher's vanity dressed up as doctrine? Here we must be honest. There is no way to read Diogenes' account and be certain. It is possible that Zeno was ill in ways the sources do not report, that the broken toe was merely the last of a series of signs, that a man of his age knew what the fall meant in a way we, who have not been 98, cannot know. It is also possible that he was theatrical at the end, that he wanted the death to fit the teaching, that he arranged the scene as he had arranged so many arguments in that colonnade. The Stoic tradition, in preserving the story, did not pretend to solve this. It offered the story as an example of the fitting act and left the interpretation to the student. What we can say is this: Zeno held that death is not an evil. He held this not as consolation, but as a technical claim about the nature of the good. The good for Zeno is virtue, and virtue is a certain condition of the rational soul, and that condition can obtain in a life of any length. Length does not add virtue. Duration does not compound the good. A life of 100 years does not contain more good than a life of 40 if the 40 were lived rightly. And a life prolonged past the point at which its role can be performed does not gain in goodness by the prolonging. It simply extends the performance past its natural close. This is a hard doctrine. It cuts against every instinct we have and against most of the counsel we receive from our physicians, our families, and our own fear. But it is Zeno's doctrine, and it is the doctrine on which the Stoics would build their whole account of the good death, that the door is not locked, that the fitting act may be to walk through it, and that the walking through, when it is fitting, is not a defeat of philosophy, but its completion. Let us stand back from the scene and see what Zeno is teaching us. He is teaching that a life is a shape, and that shapes have ends. He is teaching that the same reason which guides us to preserve our lives when preservation is fitting also guides us to release them when release is fitting, and that neither preservation nor release is, in itself, the good. The good is the reason. The good is the accordance of the act with what the moment calls for. This is not a doctrine about suicide, and it must not be received as one. The Stoics were rigorous about the conditions under which the door might be opened, and those conditions did not include unhappiness, disappointment, grief, or the ordinary sufferings of a human life. They included only the failure of the body to sustain the rational performance, the compulsion by external force to act unjustly, and the sacrifice of one's life on behalf of country or friend. Outside these conditions, the fitting act is to remain, to endure, to continue the performance, however difficult it becomes. What Zeno's death teaches, then, is not that we should be quick to leave. It teaches that we should be free of the fear of leaving. It teaches that the same rational faculty which examines every other act of our lives and asks of each whether it fits the moment, must be permitted to examine this last act also, and to ask of it the same question. Most of the time, the answer will be no. It is not yet fitting. The role is not yet complete. There is more that reason asks of us, but the question must remain askable. The door must remain a door. There is a further teaching, and this one is perhaps the deepest. Zeno lived, we are told, in accordance with his teaching. He did not preach one doctrine and practice another. He did not tell his students that virtue was sufficient and then cling to his life as though virtue were not enough. When the moment came, or when he judged the moment had come, he acted as he had taught. The philosophy and the life closed into one shape. The Athenians recognized this. That is why their decree honoring him mentioned it explicitly. In a city that had known many philosophers and many of them frauds, they marked out this one for the fact that he had not been a fraud. The teaching and the man were the same. This is what the doctrine of the fitting act finally asks of us. Not that we die well, though it asks that too. It asks that whatever we do, at whatever hour of our lives, be an act we can defend by reason, and be an act consistent with the acts that preceded it, and be an act which, if it were the last act of our lives, would not shame the acts that came before. Every kathekon is a small rehearsal of the last kathekon. Every fitting act is a fragment of the shape, which, when the shape is complete, will be the life. Marcus Aurelius, writing 4 centuries later in a tent on the Danube, would put the same thought in his own words. He said, and I quote from the translation of George Long, "Pass then through this little space of time conformably to nature, and end thy journey in content, just as an olive falls off when it is ripe, blessing nature who produced it, and thanking the tree on which it grew. The olive does not decide when it is ripe, but the olive, when ripe, does not cling. It falls, and its falling is not a failure of the tree, but the fulfillment of what the tree was for." Zeno, on the steps of the Stoa, may have been an olive judging itself ripe. He may have been wrong. The sources do not let us know. What the sources let us know is that he thought the judgment was his to make, and that he made it in accordance with the philosophy he had taught, and that the Athenians, who had watched him make it, honored him for it. We come now to the close. You have listened to an account of a death that took place more than 23 centuries ago, in a city whose stones are still visible, on the porch of a building whose foundations can still be walked. The man who died there founded a school which taught, among many other things, that the length of a life is not the measure of a life, and that reason may be trusted to know when a role is complete. He tested that teaching on himself. What conclusion he reached, and whether his reaching of it was correct, we cannot from this distance be sure. But he reached it in his own person, and he acted on it, and the tradition preserved the acting. There's a question one may carry from this, not the question of whether one would, in some extremity, choose as Zeno chose. That question is remote, and to rehearse it now, in a life that is not in extremity, would be to indulge in the very theatrics the Stoics warned against. The question is nearer than that. The question is this: if your life were to close today, in this hour, in the posture and the occupation in which you now find yourself, would the shape be one you could defend by reason? Would the acts of this day be consistent with the acts of the days before it? Would the teaching you have received from whatever source, and the life you have lived, close into one shape, as Zeno's did? Or would they stand apart, the teaching in one place, and the life in another, unreconciled? You do not have to answer now. Zeno would not have asked you to answer now. He would have asked you to walk home as he walked home, and to sit with the question through the evening, and to see what the morning revealed. That is what the fitting act asks of us, not a grand decision, a small examination made daily of whether the act before us fits the moment we are in, and whether the moment we are in fits the life we have been building, and whether the life we have been building is one that a rational being could recognize as its own. The porch is empty now. The frescoes have long since faded from the walls, but the question the old man asked on the stones outside is still the question, and it is still ours to answer.